"I felt like a murderer." That was the chilling words of Nancy Wilson from the icon rock band Heart. But what did it mean, and how did it almost destroy the band? We will find that out in this video and some other untold stories of Nancy Wilson while showing you some of her rare photos. The youngest of three sisters, Nancy was born on March 16, 1954, in San Francisco to parents John and Lois Wilson. Her father, a military man serving in the Marine Corps, moved around a lot from one military base to the next. The family followed him around all over the world to places like Panama and Taiwan. That's how Nancy and her sister, Anne's love for music began. While living in these strange and wonderful countries, the family yearned for the music that they knew and loved. But since there was no music to their taste, they had to make their own. Nancy's father retired from the military in the early 60s, and they settled in Seattle when she was 6 years old. It's true, as the saying goes, one man's loss is another man's gain. Or at least in this case, it was true for Nancy and Anne. When Nancy was around 9 years old, Anne fell terribly ill with mono disease. She was too sick to go to school and for 3 weeks wasn't allowed to leave the house. To lift Anne's spirits and stop her from going insane, her mother bought her a cheap guitar to keep her occupied. However, it was Nancy who immediately fell in love with that guitar. It turned out she was an absolute natural. She was so brilliant that her family nicknamed her Whiz Fingers. Nancy played non-stop day in and day out. For Nancy, life was a fairy tale. But for poor Anne, on the other hand, it was a living hell. While Nancy was having fun with her guitar, Anne was being teased at school for being overweight. From Tanko to Tubalard, Anne was called every horrible name you can think of by the other kids. The fact that Anne had a terrible stutter only made the teasing worse. But from her pain, she found something beautiful: singing. She discovered that singing not only comforted her, but it helped her to control her stutter. Together, Nancy and Anne's music career took root. Anne was the first to audition for a band called Hocus Pocus, who were desperately looking for a vocalist. Within an hour after auditioning, Anne got the part, and the band was renamed. They called themselves Heart. In 1975, Nancy dropped out of college and joined the band. Just 19 years old and ready for wild adventures, it wasn't long before she set her eyes on the band's guitarist, Roger Fisher. It was pretty clear to everyone that Roger immediately had a crush on her from the moment she stepped into the band. But it was Nancy who took matters into her own hands to make the first move. As she said, "I just caved in. I was ready for a little action." At the time, Anne was also dating Roger's brother Michael, who escaped being drafted into the military by running away to Canada. One of Heart's most famous songs, Magic Man, was directly based on Anne and Michael's relationship. He also ended up as the band's first manager. But however sweet Nancy and her lover's romance was at the start, it would almost destroy Roger and the entire band. The band's initial reception wasn't great, and their first album, Dreamboat Annie, struggled to gain traction. Many thought the band was a gimmick, two pretty sisters dating two handsome brothers, all part of the same band. Struggling to stay afloat, the band hit an ultra-low point while playing a local club in Canada. They were booked for a 2-week gig but got brutally fired after 4 nights when Anne made a harsh joke on stage about the hotel's food. Just as the band was literally about to set fire to the dressing room out of revenge, the hotel's manager stepped in. It changed their world forever. "Well, I've got some good news and some bad news," he told them. The band already knew they were fired. That much was clear. So what was the good news? "The good news is, you're gonna open up for Rod Stewart in 4 days," he told them. Unbeknownst to Nancy and the rest of the band, a local station in Montreal had been continuously playing their song Dreamboat Annie on the radio. By the time the band stepped out on stage, everyone knew the lyrics and sang along. The band shot to overnight stardom, sold over 1 million copies of their album, and immediately began work on their second album, Magazine. But all that fame and glory came crashing down in a single moment of shock and disgust. When Nancy opened up a copy of Rolling Stone, she could not believe what she saw. It was a picture of her and her sister, with a terribly suggestive headline that read, "Heart's Wilson sisters confess, it was only our first time." The headline made Nancy and Anne out to be lesbian lovers who had made love with each other. But it wasn't the fault of the magazine. It was a bitter betrayal by the president of their record label, Shelley Siegel, in an effort to advertise and promote the band. As Nancy later revealed, the sisters would also discover the disturbing truth as to why their song got played on the radio so much. As per their website, Siegel plied DJs with cocaine and prostitutes in return for playing the band's singles. Nancy and her sister went to war with the record label, leading to a 2-year legal battle, and the band ultimately signed with a new label. Their song, Barracuda, was written about their alleged lesbian lovers scandal. But another real-life lovers scandal would almost crush Nancy completely. Blaming it on his boozing and substance use, Roger cheated on Nancy and left her heart shattered in a million pieces. She was devastated. More devastating was that she couldn't simply break up with Roger. In the band's early days, fans labeled them a gimmick because the band consisted of 2 sisters dating 2 brothers. Now, fans lapped up the idea and absolutely loved it. To keep fans happy, Nancy and Roger had to keep on pretending that they were still in love. But behind the scenes, Nancy was falling apart and also in love again with the band's drummer, Mike DeRosier. The love triangle and Roger's jealousy hit a boiling point one day on stage during a live show. Roger snapped and smashed his guitar in front of thousands of fans, but it did not stop there. He had another meltdown in the dressing room and smashed another guitar, this time almost hitting Nancy. Things got so crazy intense that Nancy had to run for safety. Roger got dumped from the band, and less than a month later, Roger's brother also left the band and dumped Ann for another woman. However, Nancy's love life would cause more drama for the band as her relationship with drummer Mike was starting to fall apart. The band was shattered, and so was Nancy. That whole era was when I was at my most lost. In terms of substances and alcohol, stuff like that, I don't feel I was able to focus that well. I couldn't focus enough to go into the studio and make it work. Their 5th album, Private Audition, was by all accounts a failure. In part, Nancy blamed herself. I know I was doing a lot of partying in those days. I don't think the original version had my own self on them. But in truth, the entire band was a mess. We probably weren't in our right minds very well, Nancy admitted. Nancy and Ann picked up the pieces and built the band up again with new members, but their career only spiraled more and more into the abyss. Their next album, 1983's Passion Works, was an even bigger flop. As a result, they got dumped by their record label. However, in 1985, there was a shimmer of hope on the horizon when they were picked up by Capitol Records. Their next album was a massive hit, and Heart was back on top. But once again, Nancy's love life would threaten to destroy the band. Amidst the turmoil in her own personal life, she managed to find a ray of light in all the darkness. Her pain from her disastrous split with the band's drummer was still fresh and raw when she was introduced to filmmaker Cameron Crowe. It was love at first sight, and 5 years later, in 1986, the couple got married. This was just 1 year after their newfound success with Capitol Records. Now married, the constant touring and being away from her husband started to take its toll on Nancy. More crushing to her was that she wanted to become a mother, but no matter how hard she tried, she simply could not get pregnant. My main focus was on becoming pregnant. It consumed me, but it did not go well. In 1995, Nancy quit the band to concentrate on her family and fertility treatment, but to Ann, it was a devastating blow. It was one of the hardest decisions Nancy ever had to make, but for once, she had to put herself first. When I left Ann's that day, I felt like a murderer. I was surprised I'd actually had the courage to do it, but it still felt awful. After her split from Heart, Nancy worked on music scores for her husband's films, including major titles like Jerry Maguire, Vanilla Sky, and Almost Famous. In January 2000, Nancy and Cameron welcomed twins, Curtis and William. 2 years later, Nancy rejoined the band and they released their 13th studio album, Jupiter's Darling, in 2004. In 2010, Nancy suffered another heartbreak when her marriage crumbled. She and Cameron divorced later that year, and in 2012, she married Jeff Bywater. Heart released 3 more albums, Red Velvet Car in 2010, Fanatic in 2012, and the ironically named Beautiful Broken in 2016. And why so ironic? Because later that same year, everything went to hell in a handbasket, Nancy said. The sisters had a massive fight after Ann's new husband was arrested on assault charges. But he didn't just get physical with anyone. He laid his hands on Nancy's 16-year-old boys. Things were already strained between Nancy and her sister before the incident, but it was the final wedge that drove the sisters apart. My sister and I sort of went off in different directions and have hardly communicated since. It has been painful, just a nightmare. However, in 2019, they briefly reunited for a charity performance. And again, they briefly reunited in December 2023. In April 2024, Heart kicked off a world tour with both sisters front and center. So does this mean the sisters have reconciled and Heart is back together for good? Maybe, but also maybe not. In a recent interview, Nancy had this to say about the band's future. "We don't have plans for that right now. We don't really plan too far in the future. We're not calculating like that. We're just gonna do this tour and see what comes." If you enjoyed this video, there's a good chance you'll also enjoy the one showing on your screen right now. Click, enjoy, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you on the next one.